Good evening. On World News today, escalation at sea, fractures within alliances, and unrest on America's streets. From a dramatic US military seizure of a Russia flagged oil tanker in the Atlantic, triggering sharp condemnation from Moscow, to protests against immigration enforcement spread across multiple states in the United States. We begin with the high seas confrontation that is rapidly widening global fault lines. New visuals have surfaced of US forces boarding and seizing a Russian flagged oil tanker in the Atlantic Ocean after a weeks long pursuit, a move that has escalated tensions with Moscow and piled fresh pressure on Venezuela. The vessel, formerly known as Bella 1, had been sanctioned by Washington for operating within what the US calls a shadow fleet transporting illicit oil. Here's what unfolded on the high seas.
Russia now threatens nuclear retaliation after the United States seized a Russian oil tanker at sea. What began as a sanctions enforcement operation is now triggering dangerous escalation between two nuclear powers. So, what exactly happened, and how close is this to spiraling out of control? Let's break it down. On January 7, 2026, U.S. forces, including Navy SEALs and the Coast Guard, boarded and seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker called Marinera, about 190 miles south of Iceland in the North Atlantic Ocean. This wasn't a sudden move. The tanker had been under pursuit for nearly 2 weeks. Back on December 21st, in the Caribbean Sea, the ship evaded an initial U.S. boarding attempt while heading to load sanctioned Venezuelan oil. According to U.S. officials, this ship was part of a so-called shadow fleet, vessels accused of secretly moving oil for Russia, Iran, and Venezuela in violation of U.S. sanctions. During the chase, the tanker allegedly changed its name, flag, and registration, a classic tactic to avoid capture. By the time U.S. forces boarded it, the ship was empty, but the message was already clear. At the same time, the U.S. also seized another tanker, the Sophia, in the Caribbean, described as stateless and linked to Chinese operators. Here's where things get more dangerous. During the operation, Russian naval assets, including a submarine and surface vessels, were in the same area, escorting the tanker. Russia had formally asked the U.S. to stop the pursuit. Washington refused. U.S. European Command says there was no direct confrontation, but the proximity alone raised alarms. The crew, which includes Russian nationals, was detained. Russia claims they were taken hostages. The U.S. says this is a lawful detention with possible criminal charges for sanctions evasion. Moscow's response was immediate and explosive. Senior Russian lawmakers called the seizure piracy, an attack on Russian sovereignty. One official openly suggested torpedoing U.S. ships and evoked Russia's nuclear doctrine, which allows nuclear use if sovereignty is threatened. So far, no military retaliation has happened, but the rhetoric alone is enough to rattle global nerves. This incident doesn't exist in isolation. It comes amid war in Ukraine, tightening U.S. sanctions on Russian energy, and a major shift in Venezuela. Just days earlier, the U.S. captured Nicolas Maduro, installed an interim government, and demanded Venezuela cut ties with Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. Venezuela has now agreed to sell tens of millions of barrels of oil to the U.S., with Washington controlling the sales. China has called this economic bullying. The big question now, will Russia move beyond words, or will diplomacy step in before a single miscalculation turns a tanker seizure into a global crisis?
Russia has meanwhile strongly condemned the tanker seizure, accusing the United States of acting beyond international law. Moscow says the tanker, renamed Marinera, was legally sailing under the Russian flag, backed by a temporary permit issued late last year. Russia insists Washington had no authority to use force against a vessel on the high seas. Here's Moscow's response.
Russia is furious, and the warnings coming out of Moscow are explosive. After U.S. forces seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker in international waters, Russian officials are now openly talking about sinking American boats. The vessel at the center of the storm is the tanker Marinera, formerly known as Bella 1. U.S. military forces, working with the Coast Guard, boarded and seized the ship in the North Atlantic, north of Scotland, under a warrant issued by a U.S. federal court. Washington claims the tanker was part of a network transporting sanctioned oil linked to Venezuela and Iran. But Moscow strongly rejects that claim. Russia's foreign ministry says the seizure was illegal, calling it a gross violation of international maritime law. Officials insist the ship was lawfully registered under the Russian flag and was operating in accordance with both Russian and international regulations. They are also demanding the immediate release of the vessel, safe treatment of Russian crew members, and their return home. Then came the most alarming statement. Russian lawmaker Alexei Zhuravlev warned that the U.S. must be stopped, even suggesting torpedo attacks and sinking American Coast Guard vessels. His message: the U.S. is acting with total impunity, and only force will make it back down. To attack with torpedoes, to sink a couple of American Coast Guard boats. Normally, they guard their shore several thousand kilometers away from it. I think the United States, which is in a kind of euphoria of impunity after the special operation in Venezuela, can only be stopped now with such a click on the nose. Washington claims the Marinera vessel was part of a network of ships used to transport sanctioned oil linked to Venezuela and Iran. Meanwhile, in Russia, the seizure has been framed as a direct violation of international law and Russian sovereignty. Russian officials have insisted that the tanker was lawfully registered under the Russian flag and was operating in accordance with both Russian and international regulations. The Russian Ministry of Transport earlier said the Marinera received a temporary permit to sail under the Russian Federation flag on December 25, 2025. According to the ministry, the vessel was boarded by U.S. naval forces on the high seas outside the territorial waters of any state, after which contact with the tanker was lost. Russian authorities have repeatedly cited the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which guarantees freedom of navigation in international waters and restricts the use of force against foreign-flagged vessels. The situation is even tenser after reports that Russian naval assets, including a submarine, were operating nearby during the seizure. The Kremlin hasn't officially endorsed threats of retaliation, but the rhetoric alone shows how fast this incident is escalating. Another ship seized, another flashpoint at sea, and a growing risk that sanctions enforcement could turn into something far more dangerous.
In a rare and chilling warning, Denmark has told the United States that its troops have standing orders to open fire if Greenland is invaded, even if the aggressor is a NATO ally. The warning follows renewed statements from the United States President Donald Trump, who has once again described Greenland as a national security priority and pushed the idea of a US takeover. 7 European and NATO nations have publicly backed Denmark, reaffirming that Greenland is Danish territory and not for sale. Here's why this rhetoric is rattling the alliance.
Danish soldiers in Greenland would shoot first and ask questions later if the U.S. invaded. Why are we talking about it now? Well, U.S. rhetoric about Greenland has heated up. President Trump has called Greenland a national security priority, and that prompted Denmark's defense ministry to confirm to reporters, yes, Danish soldiers would resist. No hesitation, no exceptions, even if the invading force came from a NATO ally like the US. This isn't some new policy. It's actually from 1952, a Cold War-era military directive. Back then, Denmark was worried about the Soviets moving into the Arctic. The rule told Danish troops in Greenland to immediately take up arms against any invading force without waiting for orders. Fast forward to today, and it turns out that rule is still in effect. Here's the context. Denmark has about 7,000 deployable troops, though only a small number are stationed in Greenland at any given time. The U.S. does have a presence there at PUTIN Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, but under the 1951 Defense Agreement. That means roughly 150 American personnel operate there for missile warning and space surveillance, but Denmark still controls the territory. The U.S. doesn't own Greenland. It doesn't get to expand bases at will. So does this mean war? Right now, the rhetoric seems aimed at pressuring Denmark into a deal, not prepping an invasion. Officials in Washington have said military action is always an option, but buying Greenland peacefully is still the preferred path.
Well, that's something that's currently being actively discussed by the president and his national security team. And I would point out that the acquisition of Greenland by the United States is not a new idea. This is something that presidents dating back to the 1800s have said is advantageous for America's national security.
But here's why it matters. Greenland is part of Denmark, a NATO member. If the U.S. tried to take it by force, NATO Article 5 would kick in, and suddenly allies would have to choose sides. That's why 7 European countries, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and UK, came out together saying Greenland belongs to its people, we stand with Denmark. The U.S. doesn't have a historical claim either. Greenland has been under Danish control for centuries, got home rule in 1979, and full autonomy in domestic affairs since 2009. Past attempts by the U.S., from Truman's 1946 purchase offer to Trump's 2019 proposal, have all been rejected. And this comes right after the U.S. operation in Venezuela, where American forces captured Maduro and seized millions of barrels of oil. That's why analysts are paying attention, because using military force to secure resources could destabilize alliances, fracture NATO, and invite opportunistic moves from Russia and China. It's not WW3 tomorrow, but it's a tension you definitely want to watch. So here's the bottom line. Denmark is sending a clear message. Greenland is theirs to defend. Any attempt to take it by force will be met with armed resistance. And in the Arctic, in 2026, that's a line you don't want to cross.
So, from alliance tensions abroad to unrest at home, across the United States, protests are unfolding against immigration enforcement as we speak, with demonstrations reported in New York, North Carolina, and Texas. Activist groups have organized coordinated rallies outside federal buildings, accusing United States authorities of heavy-handed immigration policies. Crowds have already gathered in New York City, while multiple protests are scheduled across North Carolina this evening. Here's the latest from the ground.
What began as an immigration raid in Minneapolis has now exploded into nationwide outrage. An ICE agent shot and killed a 37-year-old mother of 3, and within hours, protests erupted, schools shut down, and federal vehicles were attacked. Now, officials are telling very different stories about what really happened. Wednesday morning, in a quiet, snow-covered neighborhood just south of downtown Minneapolis, Renee Nicole Macklin Good sat behind the wheel of her SUV. Minutes later, she was dead, shot in the head by a federal immigration officer. ICE and Homeland Security officials quickly claimed the shooting was self-defense, saying the woman tried to ram officers with her vehicle.
I want to reiterate, first with all of you, the facts of what happened today. At 10:25 a.m. Central Time, Immigration and Customs Enforcement were carrying out lawful operations here in Minneapolis. Because of the adverse weather that Minneapolis has seen in recent snow, one of the vehicles became stuck and ensnared in the snow. Law enforcement were attempting to push out this vehicle, and when a mob of agitators that were harassing them all day began blocking them in, shouting at them, and impeding law enforcement operations. ICE officers and agents approached the vehicle of the individual in question, who was blocking the officers in with her vehicle. and she had been stalking and impeding their work all throughout the day. ICE agents repeatedly ordered her to get out of the car and to stop obstructing law enforcement, but she refused to obey their commands. She then proceeded to weaponize her vehicle, and she attempted to run a law enforcement officer over. This appears as an attempt to kill or to cause bodily harm to agents, an act of domestic terrorism. The ICE officer, fearing for his life and the other officers around him and the safety of the public, fired defensive shots. He used his training to save his own life and that of his colleagues. He was treated at a local hospital, has been released, and is now with family. I encourage the American people at this point in time to pray for him, but also to pray for the deceased's family and her loved ones.
But Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey called that explanation garbage, saying video footage directly contradicts the federal account. According to witnesses, Macklin Good was trying to leave the area when agents surrounded her car. One nearby resident says an officer stood in front of the vehicle, pressed against the hood, and then fired multiple shots through the windshield. Despite federal officials labeling the incident domestic terrorism, local leaders aren't buying it. Mayor Frey and Governor Tim Walz both say this tragedy was predictable and preventable.
This morning we learned that an ICE officer shot and killed someone in Minneapolis. My deepest condolences to the family, to the loved ones who had to learn about this tragic event on national television. We've been warning for weeks that the Trump administration's dangerous, sensationalized operations are a threat to our public safety, that someone was going to get hurt. Just yesterday, I said exactly that. What we're seeing is the consequences of governance designed to generate fear, headlines, and conflict. It's governing by reality TV, and today that recklessness cost someone their life. I've reached out to Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, and I'm waiting to hear back. Let me be clear, Donald Trump and his administration may not care much about Minnesota, that's been pretty evident, but we love this state. We won't let them tear us apart, we'll not turn against each other. To Minnesotans I say this, I feel your anger, I'm angry.
Within hours, protesters flooded the streets chanting, "ICE out of Minnesota." Some demonstrators clashed with heavily armed federal agents wearing gas masks. Chemical munitions were fired, ICE vehicles were damaged, and spontaneous protests spread to other cities across the country. Minneapolis public schools canceled classes and activities for 2 days, citing safety concerns. This shooting happened just 1 mile from where George Floyd was murdered in 2020, reopening deep wounds in a city still shaped by police violence protests. The Twin Cities have also become a major target of the Trump administration's latest immigration crackdown, particularly against the Somali American community. More than 2,000 federal officers have been deployed to the area as ICE operations intensify. Family members described Renee Macklin Good as compassionate, deeply religious, and devoted to her children. She had just dropped off her 6-year-old son at school that morning. The FBI is investigating the shooting. Federal officials stand by the agent. City and state leaders are demanding accountability, and tensions remain high as protests continue. One woman is dead, a city is on edge, and once again, America is confronting the explosive intersection of immigration enforcement, federal power, and the use of deadly force.
So, tonight, a world where enforcement is pushing into open confrontation. Alliances are being stress-tested, and domestic pressures are spilling onto the streets. That's world news for you. I am Pankaj Mishra. Thanks for watching.